is now my honor to introduce the first of our three authors. She is an Academy Award-winning actress who has been honored by the National Society of Film Critics, the Independent Spirit Awards, and the Golden Globe Awards. Her memoir, Watch Me, goes on sale November 11th. Please welcome Anjelica Huston.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Neil Patrick. This morning I wanted to start off with a poem by Marguerite Ann Johnson, who was born on April the 4th, 1928, died yesterday, May the 28th, at 86 years old at her home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. A Brave and Startling Truth by Maya Angelou. We, unaccustomed courage, exiles from delight, live coiled in shells of loneliness until love leaves its high, holy temple and comes into our sight to liberate us into life. If we are bold, love strikes away the chains of fear from our souls. Love costs all we are and will ever be. Yet it is only love which sets us free, a brave and startling truth. It is possible and imperative that we discover a brave and startling truth. When we come to it, we, this people, on this wayward floating body created on this earth, of this earth, a climate where every man and every woman can live freely without sanctimonious piety and without crippling fear. When we come to it, we must confess that we are the possible, we are the miraculous, the true wonders of this world. That is when, and only when, we come to it. Morning, everyone. Thank you all for welcoming me to BookExpo America. I'm thrilled to be here alongside the handsome and gracious Tavis Smiley, who I had the good fortune of sitting down with not too long ago, and the acclaimed author and fellow dog lover, Lisa Scottolini. My first introduction to book publishing was only last fall, when my coming-of-age memoir, A Story Lately Told, was released by Scribner. It was very rewarding to be embraced into your community with such enthusiasm, and I thank you for receiving me so graciously. Obviously, I didn't stay away for too long, because here I am, back again with a new book, Watch Me. In my 20s and 30s, I was often asked that famous line, when are you going to have a baby? And unfortunately, ultimately, that didn't happen. And then in my 50s, the question became, when are you going to write a book? And that was sort of easier, I thought. And since I've always been a reader, it was something I gently considered through the years, but to be honest, I was sort of afraid of exposing myself and embarrassing my friends. In December 2008, my husband of almost 17 years died, and I found myself alone quite suddenly and in a state of shock. I lost my mother to a car crash when I was 17, so I knew quite a lot about loneliness and abandonment. I knew enough about sorrow to know that it was not a time to hold on to things too tightly. When you do that, you're apt to kind of go down. So instead, I made a conscious effort to liberate myself by ceasing to accumulate things, hoarding, I'll be honest, and to start clearing the decks a bit, to open the doors to let some new air in. Growing up, I kept my secrets very close to heart, but lately, and because maybe it followed deep loss, I've become more prone to sharing my feelings and writing for me was a lot about that. My mother was a beautiful writer, as was my father, but people don't know so much about her. Her name was Enrica Georgia Soma. She was beautiful, New York Italian, ballet dancer. Before my brother Tony and I were born, she studied with Balanchine and she danced with Jerome Robbins on Broadway. Her photograph was published in the June 9th, 1947 cover of Life magazine. Philippe Halsman had come to photograph the prima ballerina at the New York City Ballet and saw my mother and took her photograph instead. And she was likened to the Mona Lisa in the picture, which was featured on the cover of Life magazine as a young ballerina. I think most of my deep attraction from the arts actually comes from my mother. She gave me Colette to read when I was 13 years old. She wanted to share the beauty of the language, the descriptions, how to eat a peach, how a park smelled at springtime. She treasured beautiful things and she wrote fantastic letters and she found humor in life. What I loved most was to go with her to the theater. It was as much through her as through my father that I received the best acting education, the art of live performance, which Mr. Neil Patrick Harris can tell us all about. My father, John Huston, was a film director. He loved adventure. He was a wonderful storyteller. He was a painter. He was very creative. He was challenging. He instilled in my brother and me the importance of being informed, to ask questions, to never stop learning. He was loving, he was strong-minded and inquisitive. He always said that interest was the most important thing in life. And in the mornings when my brother Tony and I were growing up in Ireland, we'd go up to his bedroom to have breakfast with him. And he would start the day by asking, "What news?" And I'd seen him the night before, so I wouldn't have much to report. So I had to make things up. And sometimes the stories became quite fanciful. But he was good. He sort of let me get away with it. And hearing our father tell stories was something else, something wonderful. And we begged him to retell the ones we loved the most. My father reading Old Yeller was something not to be believed. A large part of growing up in Ireland was storytelling. And that's sort of how I think now. I think in stories. My brother Tony and I grew up in the West Country in the 50s, in the middle of County Galway, in an 18th century manor, St. Clarence, near the small village of Crockwell. We didn't see many other children and we were tutored. My life was largely entertained by fantasy. I liked to decorate, and I used to make homes for the fairies in the hollows of the chestnut trees with my doll's furniture. We didn't have television. It didn't exist in Ireland until 1962, which sounds like a long time ago now, but it wasn't then. I spent quite a lot of time in front of the bathroom mirror, where we had a stack of books, and one of my favorite was the cartoons of Charles Addams. I'd pretend to be Morticia Addams, pulling my eyes back to see how I'd look with slanted eyelids, and I used to practice what I thought would be Morticia in motion. My brother suspected that perhaps I was using this ability to, I would make Morticia cry, basically. I'd pull my eyelids back, force a tear down, and then practice it on the parents. And my brother thought I was using this to my advantage, and he was probably right. But for me, it was always about stirring up feelings. I spent a lot of time in veils, and I loved to dress up. Nuns and brides were my favorite subject matter. I remember running back and forth with Tony in and out of our bedroom, putting on crazy outfits from the dress-up hamper to make our parents laugh, and feeling extraordinary satisfaction at that early applause. My first dramatic effort before an audience came one Christmas time when I was 8 years old. Friends of my parents had come to stay at St. Claren's, and their daughter Joan, a few years older than I, decided we should put on a piece for the adults. And she'd chosen a scene between the three witches from Macbeth, a play at 8 years old I was unfamiliar with. Still, we went mad gathering our costumes and our props, and when the moment came and we took our places in the dark around an African brass cauldron in the front hall, the audience included not only my parents, but the gorgeous actor Peter O'Toole. And what was meant initially as a lark became deeply serious, and when it was my turn to speak, I had a total panic attack and ran and hid behind the curtains in the study. I finally emerged sometime later to seek solace in my mother's lap. Later, when I was going to high school in London, I built up the courage and auditioned for an open call for Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. I was hoping to get the part, and I'd been called back a couple of times, but my father had other plans for me and wrote to Franco Zeffirelli to tell him I was not available and that I'd be joining him on a movie that he would be making in Austria, A Walk with Love and Death. The experience was a difficult one for me. I was unhappy in the role. I felt claustrophobic being directed by my father. I wanted to be in Italy, playing Juliet, having fun and feeling free from parental pressure. So soon after we completed the film, I took a part understudying Marianne Faithfull as Ophelia at the Roundhouse in London, with Tony Richardson directing. On January the 29th, 1969, my mother died driving from London to Italy. Her death was cataclysmic for me. I decided to leave London and to move to New York City when Hamlet transferred. Initially, I lived with Joan, my fellow witch from Macbeth, all those years before in Ireland. And shortly afterwards, A Walk with Love and Death came out, and I had to go on a press tour. Particularly hard since I'd personally received some breathtakingly bad reviews. One critic said, can you believe I'm quoting this? There is a perfectly blank, supremely inept performance by Huston's daughter, Anjelica, who has the face of an exhausted gnu. That would be GNU, GNU. The voice of an unstrung tennis racket, and a figure of no discernible shape. Sometimes I've wished I couldn't read. I spent the next 4 years in New York City, where once I partially built up my confidence, I was able to find work as a fashion model and fell in love with a photographer, Bob Richardson, who was substantially older than I was. Bob taught me about lighting and the camera, and how to move in front of the lens, how to establish a rhythm with the photographer, and how to become aware of what the camera sees subjectively. These lessons would be critical to my skills as an actress later on. At 21, I broke off my relationship with Mr. Richardson and I moved to Los Angeles. California symbolized light, warmth, glamour, and freedom. I initially stayed with my father and his new wife at her home in the Pacific Palisades, and 1 month later I met Jack Nicholson, who had become a great love of my life. A great love of my life, okay? It was 1973. Jack was on the verge of becoming a major movie star. I was with him when he made Chinatown, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and The Shining. The phone was always ringing for Jack, and that was great. But I was ambitious too, and I wanted it to ring for me as well. In 1980, I did a small part in The Postman Always Rings Twice with Jack and Jessica Lange. I played a lion tamer. After work that first evening, as we walked away from the set, Jack pointed to my trailer and said, "See what Curly put on for you?" Curly was Bob Rafelson, the director. He said, "Your own trailer, that's nice, isn't it?" And it was, but I found it hard to accept this idea of the favors and the handouts that came from being John Huston's daughter and Jack Nicholson's girlfriend. I was determined to find my own place and to be desired for my own worth. Soon after Los Angeles, I was driving down the hill from Mulholland on the way to a friend's Monday night roller skating party when a car climbing the hill in the opposite direction hit me straight on at 60 miles per hour. Thank God my little car held its ground, but I was not wearing a safety belt, and my head hit the windshield hard. I was momentarily blinded by the impact, and I felt my way out of the car and onto the curb. I had to go to hospital to have an operation to take bone splinters out of my head and to rebuild my very broken nose. But when I awakened after surgery, something new had happened. I realized that I'd survived something enormous, something life-threatening and powerful in a way that I hadn't experienced before. I was aware that I needed to change my attitude, to gain a little humility. It occurred to me that I'd been largely wasting my life until then, and that I had more to offer. I decided that I would face down my fears and move forward with determination. I remember one evening at a dinner party in Los Angeles, my friend and former director, Tony Richardson, called to me from across the room. He said, he had this great voice. He was like, "Oh, come here, you poor little thing." And he drew me onto his knee and he said, "Oh, poor dear little you. You're never going to do anything. And so much talent and nothing to show for it." I put my arms around his neck, but inside I was thinking, watch me. Someone telling me what I can't do or what I never will do brings out my most primal and childish defiance. It makes me want to scream, "Watch me," like a kid about to jump in the swimming pool. It was not that I was merely sitting around passively waiting for things to happen. It was that I still hadn't found my way. I needed to locate a teacher who responded to me, to find a place where I could unselfconsciously study the craft of acting. So it was fortunate at this juncture that I met a woman who was to change my life. Peggy Fury was not only a great acting teacher, she afforded me more than a few revelations about myself. After presenting a scene at one of her classes, she said, "Anjelica, you're a tall and imposing girl, a big presence. When you ask for something, you don't need to extend your hand. You have our attention." It was a great piece of advice, an awakening in me to the idea of confidence. I'd not realized until this moment that I was pleading for things I could just as simply have asked for. In the mid-'80s, a wonderful producer, John Foreman, gave me my big break when he handed me a book called Prizzi's Honor. The movie was to be made with my father directing and Jack Nicholson starring. First I thought, oh damn, nothing comes easy. But having embraced the opportunity to do another film with my dad was to make amends for our misunderstanding on A Walk with Love and Death. And so it was poetic justice for both of us. And Jack was my leading man. Well, let's say there was a little chemistry. And to top it off, I received an Academy Award for my performance as Mayrose Prizzi. Thank you. I think they all conspired to make it happen, and I couldn't be more grateful that my father was such a huge part of that and making it possible. So we became the first family in history to have 3 generations of Oscar winners. Dad also having directed my grandfather Walter to an Oscar for The Treasure of the Sierra Madre about 37 years earlier. It was a defining moment in my career, and I'd go on to make movies with Woody Allen, Francis Coppola, Elia Kazan, Stephen Frears, Barry Sonnenfeld, Wes Anderson, Nick Roeg, to name just a few of my favorite directors. And to be able to portray iconic roles such as Lily Dillon, Morticia Addams, and Etheline Tannenbaum. Someone informed me the other night that I've been in over 70 movies and television series, and I couldn't believe it. Every time I go to work, it feels like the first time. I was also blessed to collaborate with my father again on his last film, The Dead, based on the short story by James Joyce. Dad was suffering from emphysema and directed the film from his wheelchair, hooked up to an oxygen tank. Acts of bravery came high on his register. And here he was, bravest of all, working until his last breath. He was and he is my hero. And even though he's no longer alive, I still look to both my parents for counsel as my spirit guides. I was asked the other night at a book signing how I like to wake up in the morning, what gets me going, and what I want out of life. I've endured some big triumphs and some bigger tragedies. And my answer was this: I'm not so interested anymore in the big waves. They're hard on the heart. I like to wake up with my animals, surrounded by my friends and my family. I like to be with the people I love, good food, music, a pretty garden, a glass of wine, the sea, nature. I want to live a harmonious life. Thank you so much for sharing your morning with me.